6:45 in the morning, January the 30th, 1947, Writtle, Essex. The thermometer outside the weather station had stopped moving, not because it was broken, because the alcohol inside it had reached the bottom of the scale, -20°C in Essex, in England. The duty meteorologist, Harold Ferris, pulled his coat tighter and stared at the reading for a long moment. He had worked at the Writtle station for 11 years. He had never seen anything like this. Somewhere to the southwest, in the waters off Cornwall, the Isles of Scilly lay under 7 inches of snow. The Isles of Scilly, Britain's mildest corner, the place where palm trees grew, where January was supposed to feel like early spring, 7 inches of snow. The islands had not seen snowfall like that in living memory. This was not a cold snap. This was something else entirely. The winter of 1947 had been tightening its grip on Britain since the early days of January. Not with the sudden violence of a storm, but with the slow, methodical certainty of a siege. An anticyclone had settled over Scandinavia like a stone dropped into still water. It sat there, immovable, day after day, week after week. And because it sat there, the Atlantic depressions that normally swept in from the west, carrying their mild, damp air, their grey drizzle, their perfectly ordinary British winters, those depressions had nowhere to go. The anticyclone blocked them, pushed them south, sent them elsewhere. What came instead was the east wind. It started as a nuisance, a sharp edge to the air, the kind of cold that makes you walk a little faster between the car and the front door. By the second week of January it had become something more serious. By the third week it was pitiless. By January the 30th it was historic. Throughout the entire month of January, the highest temperature recorded anywhere in England and Wales was 14°C. 14 degrees. That was the warmest it had been, anywhere, at any point, across the entire country, for 31 consecutive days. The minimum had reached -21°C in the coldest spots, a range of 35 degrees across a single month, in a country that prided itself on having no real extremes. Britain was not built for this. The roads showed it first. Pack snow turned to iron-hard ice that road gangs could not shift. Salt supplies, sea already depleted from earlier frosts, ran short in the first 2 weeks. Lorry drivers learned quickly that certain routes were simply impassable after dark, and that certain gradients were suicide in either direction. Villages in the Pennines and across the Welsh uplands were cut off not for hours but for days, for some, longer. But it was the railways that told the real story of January 1947, because the railways, unlike the roads, were not optional. They could not simply close and wait for better conditions. Coal moved by rail, food moved by rail, people moved by rail. The factories, the hospitals, the power stations, all of it depended on a system that had been designed for a temperate island and was now operating in conditions borrowed from the Russian steppe. The locomotive crews knew the problem before the managers did. They always do. On the night of January the 21st, driver Albert Marsh and his fireman, 23-year-old Thomas Whelan, brought a coal train out of Peterborough heading west. The load was 62 wagons, iron coal hoppers, each one loaded to its limit. The sort of train that moved slowly and deliberately, that demanded patience and forward planning, that could not be hurried. They made it to Huntingdon without incident. The cold was fierce, but the locomotive, a Stania 8F, was a capable machine, 280 wheel arrangement, designed for heavy freight, designed for the gradients of the Midlands, designed to work hard in difficult conditions. Albert Marsh had driven 8Fs for 4 years. He knew what they could do. What he did not know, until that night, was what -15°C could do to a brake rigging. The problem with extreme cold and freight train brakes is not complicated to understand, but it is very difficult to solve on a moving train in the dark. The rigging that connects the brake blocks to the operating cylinder runs along the underside of the wagon. In normal winter weather, in the kind of cold that Britain normally produced, this rigging flexed and moved as it was supposed to. In -15, with ice forming on every exposed surface within minutes of exposure, the rigging froze solid. Not stiff. Solid. When Albert Marsh made his first brake application coming down the gradient west of Huntingdon, nothing happened. Or rather, something happened on the locomotive, but along the length of 62 wagons. The brakes that were supposed to grip the wheels were locked in their release position by ice, immovable, deaf to the signals being sent from the locomotive. He used the locomotive brake alone. Heavier application. 62 wagons of coal pushing from behind. Thomas Whelan, without being told, dropped sand onto the rails ahead of the driving wheels. They slowed. They stopped. 300 yards further down the track than Albert had intended, but they stopped. The two men climbed down with hammers and spent 40 minutes working along the train, breaking ice from brake mechanisms in the dark and the cold, working by lamplight, their breath turning to vapour that froze on their scarves. By the time they reached the 60th wagon, the first wagon's brakes had begun to refreeze. They got the train to its destination, 4 hours late, but they got there. Albert Marsh filed a report the following morning. It was not the first such report that week. It was not the 10th. By the end of January, the locomotive inspectors at Peterborough, at March, at Leicester, at Nottingham, were reading stack after stack of reports describing the same problem. Frozen brake rigging, frozen couplings that could not be released because the screw mechanism had iced solid, couplings that could not be connected because the hook had fused to its rest. The operating departments tried everything they had. They sent fitters along the tracks with blow lamps to thaw running gear before departure. It helped. It was not enough. They repositioned locomotives to double-head the heaviest trains, providing more brake force from the front. It helped. It was not enough. They reduced train lengths, cutting the number of wagons per service to reduce the risk. It helped, and reduced capacity exactly when capacity was most needed. The coal trains were the critical issue. Britain in January 1947 ran on coal, domestic heating, industrial furnaces, power station boilers, everything. The previous year's labour disputes had already left stockpiles below comfortable levels at many locations. Now the coldest weather in decades was driving consumption through every roof in the country at exactly the same moment that the transport system was struggling to move coal from pit to consumer. Power stations in the Midlands began reporting fuel stock levels in days rather than weeks. Factories in the West Riding of Yorkshire started receiving official notices about possible electricity rationing. In London, the Ministry of Fuel and Power was holding daily meetings by the third week of January, meetings that grew steadily less reassuring as the anticyclone refused to shift and the east wind kept blowing. The water troughs made everything worse. Locomotive water troughs were one of the defining features of the British mainline railway network. Long, shallow metal channels set between the rails at intervals along the route, kept filled by supply tanks, they allowed a locomotive to scoop up water while running at speed. The scoop dropped, the locomotive passed over the trough, water surged up into the tank. A few seconds of work that saved a prolonged station stop for watering. By mid-January, most of the water troughs on the exposed sections of the East Midlands main line were solid ice, frozen straight through to the base. The insulation jackets that wrapped the supply pipes were adequate for a normal British winter. They were not adequate for continuous overnight temperatures of -12, -15, -18 degrees. A locomotive that could not use the troughs had to stop to take water. Station water columns were kept thawed by small oil-burning heaters, but even these struggled when temperatures dropped below -10. Some failed entirely on the coldest nights. A locomotive arriving at a water column to find it frozen solid had a problem that could not be solved quickly. A locomotive that ran low on water while far from any functioning water point had a problem that could become catastrophic, because without water in the boiler the firebox crown could be exposed and the consequences of that were not recoverable. The working day of an engine crew in January 1947 had acquired a texture that no training had prepared them for. Before departure, they inspected and hammered. They checked couplings, checked brake rigging, requested fitters with blow lamps, reported defects that were recorded and noted and sometimes fixed and sometimes not, depending on how many fitters were available and how many locomotives needed attention simultaneously, which in the third week of January was always more than the depot could handle. During the run, they planned around water stops with the kind of precision that had previously been reserved for the hardest mountain routes. They watched the steam pressure gauge and the water level gauge with fresh intensity. They anticipated gradients and reduced speed on descents not to save time, but because a runaway freight train in these conditions with potentially compromised brake rigging was not something anyone wanted to think about. At Woodford Halls, a small but busy freight junction in Northamptonshire, the shed foreman, a man named George Pickett with 31 years of railway service, was making decisions every 4 hours that in normal circumstances he would have made once a day. Which locomotives were fit to work, which trains could run and which should be held, which routes were passable and which were not. He had 3 locomotives stopped for frozen injectors, the injectors that forced water into the boiler, and 2 more with brake rigging so stiff that his fitters had condemned them as not safe to work without repairs that required parts not currently in stock. He telephoned the district office 3 times on January the 28th. Each time he was told that the situation was being managed at a higher level. He replaced the receiver and went back to his shed. The situation was not in any meaningful sense being managed. It was being endured. That distinction mattered. Management implied control, options, solutions being applied. Endurance implied getting through each hour in the hope that the next one would be slightly less severe. By the final days of January, Britain's railway freight operation, on the routes that mattered most for coal, was in a state of endurance, and yet the trains ran. That is the fact that gets lost sometimes, when this period is described in terms of breakdown and crisis. Most of the trains ran, late, often, short of planned capacity frequently, with crews who had been working in conditions that no shift agreement had ever anticipated, certainly. But the trains ran. Albert Marsh and Thomas Whelan were not exceptional. Across the network, on dozens of routes, in depots from Newcastle to Bristol, engine crews and freight guards and shunters and fitters were doing what the circumstances required, because that was the job, and the job did not stop because the temperature had fallen to a level the textbook said was impossible for this latitude. At Writtle, Harold Ferris completed his morning readings and began drafting his report to the meteorological office. The anticyclone over Scandinavia showed no sign of moving. The easterly airflow was steady and deep. There was more snow in the forecast. There was always more snow in the forecast. He dated the report January the 30th, 1947, and noted the overnight minimum, -20 degrees Celsius, Writtle, Essex. He noted it in the same careful handwriting he used for every entry, in the same column alongside every other reading, because that was what the record required. Not drama, not alarm, just the number, in its column, on its date. Outside, the east wind was still blowing. It would blow for another 6 weeks,